just about time it's about what you do with it. Some people spend decades in a field but never truly evolve, while others adapt, learn, and prove themselves in a fraction of that time. Are we really measuring competence by years alone, or by actual capability? Caldwell's smirk faltered for just a second, a blink and you miss it hesitation. The audience, previously still, seemed to lean in slightly, sensing the shift in momentum. He hadn't expected her to push back with such composure. Interesting perspective, he said, his voice carrying that same patronizing lilt. But don't you think there's something to be said about respecting those who came before you? Those who have earned their place. Karoline nodded, her expression unshaken. Respect is earned through contributions, not just tenure. I have deep respect for those who paved the way, but that doesn't mean new voices should be silenced until some invisible clock runs out. The world moves fast, Mr. Caldwell. Should we really be telling people to slow down just to make others comfortable? A murmur rippled through the audience. Caldwell's smile tightened. This was not how this was supposed to go. He was used to guests stumbling, stuttering, trying to backpedal. But Karoline? She wasn't playing defense. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head with exaggerated amusement. The confidence of youth, he mused. You make it sound so simple. But tell me, Karoline, do you believe you know better than those with decades of experience? She tilted her head slightly, considering him. Then, with calm precision, she answered, I believe that every generation brings something valuable to the table. Dismissing someone just because they're younger is as flawed as dismissing someone just because they're older. The best conversations happen when people listen instead of just waiting to talk. The silence that followed was different. Not the expectant hush from before, but something heavier, like the collective realization that Karoline Leavitt was not someone to be dismissed so easily. Caldwell sat back, the flicker of annoyance barely hidden beneath his polished exterior. He had come prepared to dominate this exchange, to expose a naive, overambitious newcomer. Instead, he found himself in a conversation he couldn't control. By the time the segment ended, the entire studio sat in stunned silence. And Karoline Leavitt? She left with her head high, knowing she had done more than just hold her own. She had turned the game on its head. For a moment, the weight of Caldwell's words hanging in the air. This was his next strategy, implying that Karoline had only thrived because she hadn't been truly tested. That her success was a fragile illusion, propped up by an environment that didn't demand real scrutiny. Karoline let the silence stretch just long enough to make an impact. Then, with a small, deliberate smile, she answered, I think confidence comes from knowing your work can hold up, whether challenged or not. The difference between me and some others is that I welcome challenges. I don't hide behind years of tenure as a shield. A soft murmur rippled through the audience again. Caldwell's smirk twitched, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm against the desk. She wasn't just answering, she was reframing his entire premise. He had hoped to put her on the defensive, but instead, she had flipped the conversation back onto him. You make it sound so simple, he said, his voice still carrying that practiced edge. But let's be real, confidence without true depth is just noise. We see it all the time. People who speak well, market themselves well, but when you dig deeper, there's nothing there. Karoline leaned forward slightly, mirroring his movement. And that's exactly why people should be judged on their work, not assumptions. If someone can consistently deliver, if their insights prove valuable time and time again, why does it matter if they took a different path to get there? Caldwell exhaled sharply, that half-scoff returning. He was running out of angles. So what you're saying is tradition has no place in credibility anymore? Karoline shook her head, her voice steady. I'm saying tradition shouldn't be the only measure of it. The world evolves. The way we learn, the way we communicate, the way we prove ourselves, it's different now. And the people who refuse to see that, they're the ones who risk becoming irrelevant. For the first time, Caldwell had no immediate retort. The air in the studio shifted again, not just tense, but charged. The audience, once passive spectators, were fully engaged now. Some exchanged glances, as if recognizing that this wasn't just another interview. This was something different. Karoline didn't look away. She had walked into the studio knowing exactly what kind of battle she was stepping into. But what Caldwell hadn't expected, what he couldn't control, was that she wasn't here to defend herself. She was here to prove that the game itself had changed. And by the time the interview wrapped up, it was clear. She hadn't just held her own. She had won. Calm, yet unwavering. What happens when people decide you don't belong? When they say you haven't earned your place? When they question you, not because of your abilities, but because you didn't follow the path they expected? She let the silence stretch, the weight of her words settling over the studio. The truth is, she continued, some people will never accept change. They'll move the goalposts, they'll shift the narrative, they'll demand proof that they wouldn't ask of anyone else. But at the end of the day, their approval isn't what defines success. Results do. Caldwell held her gaze, but the balance of power had fully shifted now. The smirk, the condescension, the quiet attempts to unnerve her. None of it had worked. Instead, she had dismantled his entire approach piece by piece, not with anger or defensiveness, but with sheer, undeniable confidence. You're saying their opinions don't matter? Caldwell pressed, grasping at one last attempt to regain control. I'm saying that people's opinions should be based on something real, Karoline answered smoothly. Not just tradition. Not just discomfort with a new voice at the table. If someone can challenge my ideas with substance, with facts, I welcome it. But if the only argument is that I haven't waited my turn, that's not a real argument at all. A pause. A flicker of tension in Caldwell's expression. He had no easy retort, no clever dismissal. The audience felt it too. This wasn't just another segment. This was something different. The shift in energy was undeniable. Caldwell exhaled through his nose, pressing his lips together for a fraction of a second before finally leaning back in his chair. Well, he said, forcing a small chuckle. I suppose that's one way to look at it. Karoline simply smiled. It's not just one way, she said. It's the way things are changing, whether people like it or not. The moment hung there. The final exchange. And as the cameras kept rolling, as the studio audience remained frozen in stunned silence, it was clear. Caldwell had come prepared to break her down. Instead, she had left him with nothing but a forced smile and a conversation he no longer controlled. They never ask if you're capable. They don't question whether your ideas hold weight or if your arguments make sense. No, it always comes down to one thing, whether you deserve to be here in the first place. Karoline knew that. She had known it from the moment she sat across from Caldwell, from the second the interview began. And now, with the tension thick in the studio and all eyes locked on her, it was clearer than ever. Caldwell leaned forward slightly, latching onto the word she had just said. Deserve. Exactly, he said, his voice smooth, practiced. Because there's a difference between being loud and being qualified. Between being popular and actually earning respect. Karoline exhaled, the breath short but steady. Not out of frustration, but something closer to amusement. He thought he had her cornered. If anything, she looked stronger than she had at the start. Respect isn't given, Richard, she said. It's taken. The weight of those 3 words landed hard. Even Caldwell, always so composed, so smugly self-assured, faltered for half a second before recovering. But that half second was enough. Karoline didn't stop. You talk about qualifications, but let's be honest, a lot of people in positions of power didn't earn their spot either. They were born into the right family, had the right connections, learned how to say the right things to the right people. And no one questions whether they deserve to be there. But when someone like me, who built their own platform, who doesn't wait for permission, comes along, suddenly it's all about qualifications. The audience stirred. A few heads nodded. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Caldwell shifted slightly, crossing his arms, a subtle attempt to reassert dominance. So, you think you're above criticism? He challenged. Karoline didn't even hesitate. No, she said, her voice clear, unwavering. I think criticism should be fair. And the reality is, people like me will always be held to a different standard. We're expected to be twice as sharp, twice as prepared, twice as perfect, just to get half the respect. And when we do prove ourselves, the goalposts move. Caldwell's jaw tightened, but Karoline wasn't finished. "You call it arrogance," she said. "I call it not waiting to be given a seat at a table that was never built for me." A deeper murmur from the audience. Caldwell inhaled through his nose, his shoulders rolling back as if resetting. "That's a strong answer," he admitted, "but confidence isn't proof. If you're wrong about something, are you willing to admit it?" Karoline nodded, her expression calm. "Absolutely. But being questioned by people who've already made up their minds about me? That's not the same thing as being wrong." For the first time in the entire interview, Caldwell didn't have an immediate response. The silence stretched, not an awkward silence, but the kind that carried weight. The kind that made people think. The audience felt it. The producers behind the cameras felt it. Even Caldwell felt it. The unraveling of the narrative he had been trying to control. Karoline sat there, steady, composed. Waiting. Nothing. No smirk. No slick comeback. Just silence. Caldwell let out a slow breath. He glanced at his notes, flipping a page, then set them down. His fingers twitched slightly against the desk. He was searching for a way to regain control, something sharp enough to cut through the moment. But there was nothing left to say. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged glances. A panelist off to the side cleared their throat, as if considering stepping in, but even they hesitated, because to interrupt now would only confirm what everyone already knew. This wasn't just an interview anymore. This was a moment. And Karoline? She didn't need to fill the silence. She let it sit. Let it breathe. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do after making your point is to let people sit with it. The seconds ticked by. Too long for TV. Long enough for the audience at home to feel it. Caldwell's lips parted slightly, then pressed into a thin line. His hand found the stack of papers he had relied on throughout the interview, but this time, he didn't even look at them. He just lifted them, then let them fall against the desk with a quiet thud. He was out of moves. And Karoline? She was still right where she started. Steady. Unshaken. A producer must have recognized the significance of what had just happened because the camera angles shifted, cutting to a wider shot, framing the entire studio. The audience. The panelists. Caldwell, his posture just a little tenser than before. And Karoline unmoved. Unapologetic. Unstoppable. Finally, Caldwell let out a quiet chuckle. Forced. Hollow. "Well," he said, voice carefully controlled, "that's certainly one way to look at it." Karoline just smiled. Caldwell straightened his papers, trying to buy himself a second, then grasped for the only lifeline he had left. He glanced toward the cameras. "We'll leave it at that," he said, shifting gears. "Karoline, thank you for your time." But everyone watching knew the truth. This wasn't just an interview. This was a statement. And Karoline had made hers louder than Caldwell ever expected. When the cameras cut, the energy in the studio shifted. Not in relief. Not in the usual post-interview small talk. But in something heavier. The kind of aftermath that lingers. Producers whispered to each other. The sound tech removed his headset a little too slowly, as if still processing what had just happened. A few panelists exchanged looks but said nothing. Even Caldwell, who normally ended interviews with a firm handshake and a smooth transition to commercial, sat for a beat too long before finally pushing back his chair. Karoline?
She took her time.
She didn't rush to leave, didn't scramble to check her phone, didn't rush to shake hands with producers. She let the moment settle. Because she knew what had just happened. Everyone in that room did. A junior assistant, who had barely spoken to her when she first arrived, stepped forward, hesitant. That was really something. Karoline glanced at her, offering a small smile. "Yeah," she said. "It was." No need to say more. As she walked past the set, past the lingering crew members, she caught snippets of conversation. "She handled that better than I thought she would." Caldwell really couldn't land that last one, huh? She never backed down. Not once. Karoline didn't react. She didn't need to. Her job here was done. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she finally pulled out her phone. Her notifications were exploding. Clips from the interview were already circulating. People were talking, not just about what she said, but about how she said it. That she hadn't flinched, that she hadn't stumbled, that she had walked into a space designed to doubt her and left without giving them the satisfaction. And that's the lesson. People will always question you, not because you're wrong, but because you're different. So when they try to shake you, stand your ground, stay steady, and let your presence do the talking. Because at the end of the day, people respect what they can't shake. And Karoline? She left that studio unshaken. Subscribe for more stories like this.